Hi everyone, well welcome back. I hope you managed to grab yourself a coffee and a biscuit in the break to get you through this next session. Sorry if we had a little bit of a technical thing trying to sort out one of the presentations, but we seem to be all there now. Right, okay, so our next session we're getting into before the next break. We have two sessions. The first one is on the provision of forest ecosystem services. And then the second one is more policy related to policies for enhancing provision of forest ecosystem services. So we'll get going then on the provision one. And first up is Sven Wunder, who's the principal scientist from EFI. So Sven, I will hand the microphone over to you to get going.
Thank you very much. And I have sent my presentation to you due to some internet difficulties, and I prefer to have it run from there.
Okay, so Geisha, I'm just checking that you're hearing this and you're going to put that on. I'm hoping it will appear magically in a minute, Sven. So
no problem. It's still 14:58 on my clock at least. So.
There we have it.
That sounds good. Can we put it in presentation mode? Yeah. Great. So we are now starting a session where we're also looking at different tools to affect the provision and for environmental services. And one of these tools is paying for ecosystem services, also PS. And based on a global review of that we've undertaken in the Sincere project, I'm going to present different results. Next, please. So many of you have seen this before. It's just to be clear on what do I talk about when I'm saying PES. It's a voluntary transaction between users and providers that are made in a conditional way according to some agreed upon rules of natural resource management. And they are designed for generating off-site services. This is a fairly sort of narrow definition. There are other broader definitions out there that are more embracive. Next, please. But perhaps it's also worth to step back one step and see, what's actually the definition of services in general. And I put some of them from dictionaries up there, and you can see it's about doing things for customers rather than producing goods. And it's about, in economics, also a service is a transaction in which no physical goods are transferred from the seller to the buyer. So the things that are special about services normally compared to goods are that they are intangible, they're indivisible, they're non-exclusive, often at least they're not storable, and often they're also unique. And that chokes slightly with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that has kind of taught us how to use this terminology, and specifically about provisioning services, which in fact are goods like timber, fruits, and fodder, as Marko Lovic presented before the break. Next, please. Next, please. Hello. Yeah, thank you. Good. So this is how the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment looked at this. You have these different ecosystem services, and as Marco said, provisioning, regulating, and cultural, and they are creating different links to human well-being, and that's how they are defined, right? The question is, which of these services are adequate to be supported by PES measures in particular? If you click, please. The regulating service, definitely. because many of these are off-site services like watershed protection, like climate regulation, also biodiversity stocks in part. On the cultural side, we have a more mixed picture. We have some cultural services that are supported by PES type of contracts, and while others are being paid for directly, for instance, through an entrance fee, etc., at Forest Gate, so to speak. One more click, please. Whereas for the provisioning services, I know no single PES scheme in the world, because it's much easier to take these goods to the market and directly sell them. So what plays a role here is what Gerhard referred to before the break. What are the restrictions on marketability of these things? And often the PES way of doing it is not necessarily a true market, but maybe more of a contractual arrangement between different parties. Next, please. So where has this PES mechanism actually been used? This is what we had wanted our keynote speaker, Michael Jenkins, to give us a long story about. I'm just gonna have one slide here to say, that a lot of it has been in carbon and in watershed services. And perhaps carbon to start with, a big enthusiasm about it. Then sort of a period where that market fluctuated quite a bit downwards. We've seen a recent pickup again. Whereas watersheds probably have had a much more steady expansion over time and geographically as well. Biodiversity protection to a certain extent as well, and landscape beauty very, very, very little. But those are basically the four services around which PES has been built, and for instance are also the ones in the original Costa Rican PES in the 1990s. So the types that we are talking about are, on the one hand, that the user pays directly, like the water users downstream, or as a second possibility, that government steps in and provides subsidies, as has been said before, or provides direct payment contracts on behalf of those service users. For instance, the users of biodiversity, which is the entire society. So there are definitely more in numbers of these user finance schemes, but in terms of money and of the people being benefited, we have more of the government financed ones. Geographically, a lot of it has been in the Americas, both in North America and South America, a bit less, or quite a bit less in Asia and Europe, and very little in Africa, and often related to donor projects and trials of some kind. In Latin America, what we've seen a lot of experiences being led by municipal water utilities, being worried about a supply of clean and regular water, and hydroelectrical plants, worried about erosion, etc. And in Europe, I mean, most of the PES schemes we know have been embedded into agri-environmental public schemes. There are also a few corporate pilots out there, like the very well-known Vitel scheme. Next, please. Another question is, what is actually being paid for in these PES schemes? And this is without sort of claiming to be representative, but just looking at sort of my PES database and making a case count, not a hectare or dollar count. What we can see is we can classify these in whether they're in agriculture or in forestry. but also whether they are, use restricting. You're paying people for not doing something, or you're paying them for use modifications, such as to plant trees or to make terraces in your agricultural landscape, etc. What we can see there is really that some 4/5 of all of this is about forest conservation. It's full stop, right? That's where most of the effort has gone. And if we're saying, we can probably say that more than 9 out of 10 are about trees, are about somehow having more trees in the landscape. Very little is about changing agricultural practices, because often the environmental service that is provided by that is much inferior to the question of trees or not trees. Next, please. Also important to think about, when can PES actually not be used? And I'm pointing here to 3 predominant situations. One is the economic side of things, when the social costs of providing these environmental services actually exceed what you gain from a more benign, environmentally benign practices, and the positive externality is not valuable enough. So then, of course, you can't make things square. A second situation is institutional, in particular on the buyer side, when they can't get their act together in terms of coordinating themselves or finding the right intermediate to help them to pay, although it actually would be in their economic interests in vis-a-vis factor number 1. And the third one is if the tenure arrangements are not right. So there can be potentially, smallholders, communities that are land stewards with a large influence on the provision of environmental services. But if these de facto do not have an effective right to exclude third parties, then they can't be reliable service providers, because then other people come in and do things that jeopardize the whole scheme. And that's a critical factor, particularly in the tropics and more so in at the agricultural frontier, in newly occupied areas, and the expanding agricultural landscapes. This also means that the mechanism of PES is probably less suited to the lowest income and poorly governed regions, where especially the third condition, but also some of the other institutional things do not work well. For instance, if the payments for water as such is not well organized, then it's also difficult to get these water users together to pay for improved services. Next, please. So we can also look at, what are the factors empirically when you look across countries that actually have helped to establish PES schemes. Here we're looking at watershed PES, and we're looking at low and middle income countries. And what we can see is that the emergence of PES schemes is more likely when the rights are secure. That's the first factor. When people live in a concentrated manner, so that they live in large cities where there are many people to pay for few landowners up there, then the economic balance is easier to get right. When there are really good hydrological services at stake, so you have something to lose in terms of quantity and quality of the service. And as we've just been talking about before the break, when there are large risks, when people are scared, when some small catastrophe have happened, etc., and people are alerted to the fact that they need to do something. Next, please. So looking at the long-term transition of forest cover among countries, you often see this kind of L-shaped pattern, where U-shaped pattern, where where there's a lot of forest to start with, then with the commodity timber extraction, then agricultural commodity production picks up and you reach a low point. And after that, when countries become richer, marginal agriculture is being abandoned on the hillside and stony areas, etc., things grow back into forest in part. That's a typical transition. And you can say that PES schemes have tried in every one of these situations, as I said, to increase the forest cover for a given level of time or economic development on the x-axis. Now, if we go to the European situation, that we obviously on the right-hand side, and there things are a little bit different. You know, we have some PES for hydrological things, but also for biodiversity and wildfire and recreation. But for some of these things, it actually becomes more ambiguous whether more forest is necessarily good. Sometimes PES schemes are being used also to preserve the mosaics of agriculture and forests that are seen as attractive from a recreational point of view, that give fire breaks in potential large landscapes that could be risky in terms of wildfires. Next, please. So what obstacles have we found in relation to PES in Europe? Well, on the institutional and land tenure side, there are certainly some. Of course, there are areas where there are large protected areas, and PES is not the best tool for protected area management. There are also some large state forests where similar concerns are apply. And then there are, on the other end, somewhere there are very fragmented landscapes with very small forest owners, where the transaction costs of doing PES would be very large, making contracts with each of them. And also absentee owners, as I said, where those prevail, it's also difficult to use PES as a mechanism. But there's also often a societal vision that prevails, where we can say that it's being perceived that the provision of environmental services is a public responsibility. You know, it should be done through the regulatory powers, not through any market-based responsibilities. And hence, I was missing one, and hence there is an insufficient willingness to pay, which is not necessarily economically founded, but rather cultural, institutional, historical, etc. Next, please. We know something about, some things about what can make a PES design more effective, more additional, but too few of those are being implemented in practice. And one thing is sort of the spatial targeting. On the one hand, that you foresee where in the landscape will there be deforestation or threats, or where will landscapes, forests grow back on their own, for instance, so that you have the dynamics clear. And also, where are the high service areas? And third, if there are big differences in those two, 1 and 2, you may also want to pay more or less according to different cost levels and different threat and service levels. And fourth, of course, you need to also credibly enforce the conditionality principle as the single most important characterizing principle of this mechanism. Next, please. So ideally, it should look like this: that you select your spatially your areas to be enrolled under PES according to different layers of information about these 4 environmental services we've been talking about the threat and dynamics, and about the costs of provision. Of course, that requires you have good information about these, which is not always the case. Next, please. So in this nature sustainability piece, we looked at a database of PES schemes, and And we looked at these 3 design factors, and spatial targeting, it looks, I mean, half of them have some degree of spatial targeting, and some even of both of the mentioned factors. Payment differentiation also, it's like half-half almost. Enforced conditionality is perhaps the one that is most worrying, because that's the right-hand side pie, because half of those schemes have no really any record of an enforcement of conditionality where you sanction somebody, and etc. So maybe it's not always taken seriously, but payment differentiation, we can see that's the green areas here. We can see in the OECD countries, there's much more willingness to differentiate the payments than there is in the global south, where uniform payments are more common. Next, please. So we're drawing towards the end. The evaluated impacts of PES schemes. How well do these things actually work in terms of creating additional forest cover, at least as a proxy for those services delivered? And we can see here sort of the impact sizes on the x-axis and the different studies on the y-axis, ordered according to size. And the results are quite all over the place. And various studies we have on the same scheme that actually come out with different results according to, for instance, what region was being featured. If it's, and we can see on the panel B, we can see one of the things that can vary is threats. If these things are threatened to start with, then there is a significantly higher impact than if it's not. So the self-selection and sometimes also the administrative selection of areas of threat is quite important. And panel C, how does all of this, the PES is to the right, you can see how does it compare to other incentives, to disincentives, and to sort of enabling interventions. Quite well, but not, I mean, there are few observations, too few observations to have a sort of statistically significant difference, except vis-a-vis disincentives. So they are slightly at the border of significance to being more effective than the disincentives. Next, please. So my last slide. And we were being asked, recently by the Commission for what is needed for successful PES schemes. And I thought that our answer here is kind of summing up things quite well, and perhaps success should be seen disaggregated into, on the one hand, what's needed for these things actually to emerge on the ground, and second, what's the impact. And for the emergence, you see the sort of the willingness to pay is quite important. That you are, and it has to be bigger than the willingness to accept by landowners to participate, obviously. And the key factor here is if there are opportunity costs, if people can do other things with the land that are just too profitable, then if you can't buy these out, then they will do business as usual. The second thing is if the institutions are working well, and the third, as I mentioned, is whether the land tenure is secure and safe. I think in Europe, the land tenure is less of a problem typically, but the private willingness to pay is often limited by historical factors about perceptions of the role of the state, and lacking willingness to get engaged with private payments. Click, please. And the second thing is about impacts. So I think the spatial targeting is perhaps the single most important thing in PES design, I would say. You have to enroll lands where there's a high leverage, and where you really expect to make a difference in terms of additionality. You should differentiate payments where you can get away with that, doing it in a sound way. And on the implementation side, it's important that that you enforce sanction whenever contracts are breached, so that it becomes a credible mechanism and not just a subsidy, as was being said before. Often you get into ill enforcement strategies where the moral hazard problems apply. In Europe, the second factor of payment differentiation is better being taken care of than the first. And for three, we actually know very little about the European situation. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sven. That was really interesting. I'm just going to move then very quickly on to Harold now, and we'll come back. If you've got any Q&A for Sven, could you please use the Q&A function and put your questions in there, and then we'll ask those at the end. So Harold, back to you. You're going to be speaking about forest management and ecosystem services, upscaling project-based findings. Thank you.
Yes, again, thanks for giving the floor again. I will do this talk jointly with Bart, so it's not only myself. So we'll do this in a team effort, both together. And I think Sven has now nicely prepared the ground for this presentation, because the relevant question that we always focusing in payment for ecosystem services schemes, whether a change of these institutional settings is somehow the only thing that is relevant in terms of providing or marketing a certain service, or if forest management plays also an important role in this kind of innovations in providing this service. And so that's why Bart and myself, we have tried to explore from the case studies of the NOBEL and the Sincere project, what is the role of forest management in innovation supporting forest ecosystem services. And the outline of the talk is mainly after an introduction to focus a little bit on the role of forest management interventions. And we will present then the ecosystem service cascade model as an analytical framework for the analysis, and have then a focus on the case studies from NOBEL and Sincere, and finally come up with some conclusions. So the challenges in providing forest services for forest management are quite clear, because we have this rising demand from the growing population, different socioeconomic changes. So there's a huge interest in different services and products, and very often these services have no direct monetary value. So that's why forest management is often then favoring timber production on all the other services, because that's the only way of somehow getting a direct monetary value. On the other hand, we also see that we have an increased interest of the public in participation, knowing about the details, why some certain forest management prescriptions are implemented, what is the reason, what's the justification for that. They would like to have a stake in the public debate. On the other hand, forest managers are faced by the challenge with these different uncertainties related to climate change, related to socioeconomic conditions. So a lot of uncertainties. And in this uncertain framework, we have to make decisions about forest management in the future. And we have to come up with clear prescriptions for the next 100 years in many cases. But these long production periods makes the planning difficult. So we have to really consider the different spatial and temporal scales in making these management prescriptions, and how this affect then forest ecosystem services is a key challenge for many forest managers today. Sven has introduced the concept of Millennium Ecosystem Assessment very nicely. So the question now here is, how does forest management now really influence the provision of these ecosystem services? When we talk about these arrows, and we are interested in the interest, how they can contribute to well-being. So then the question arises, how intensive forest management can really contribute to an ecosystem change, which will then on the long run maybe influence the functions, the flows, the processes of the ecosystem, and then contribute to the well-being. When we consider now these different sets of forest ecosystem services, we also have to think about trade-offs. We have very often synergies between different forest ecosystem services. When we think about timber production on the one hand, where we would like to do an efficient harvesting, low harvesting costs, quick and easy regeneration, high production rates from the forest owner perspective. On the other hand, we focus maybe on nature conservation, where we have a high interest on deadwood, on natural dynamics, on high tree species diversity. So we could see whether they are very much conflicting, these different interests on these two services. But on the other hand, we could also see some kind of synergies, thinking about easy regeneration and deadwood on coarse woody debris could be a nice synergy between these. Or having a high diversity of tree species would also allow a broad portfolio of timber products being sold on the market. When we add another service like rockfall protection, and we talked about these natural hazards already before the break, so we can see that with the rockfall protection, we also have the other issues that have to be considered. Tree species that are not vulnerable to damages, or we would like to have permanent protection and no unstocked areas and so on. So we could see a lot of conflicts maybe also arising from combining those different services in one single forest management unit. And so this leads then directly to the scale, so the spatial scale, which is very important. So here we have to discuss also, should we segregate or should we integrate these different services? And nowadays in policy and also in forest management, we see quite nicely this debate that some services should be segregated and some others should be integrated, and sometimes we're aiming for a combined approach. But for forest management, again, we have to consider the planning unit. So is it just about nature conservation? Is it also about combining nature conservation and protection forest? Or is it also about combining timber production, protection forest, nature conservation, and even spanning maybe different forest owner properties? So not only focusing on one property, but focusing on many properties. So considering this issue, it becomes clear that it's not so easy in mind to come up with a certain conclusion. What is the contribution of forest management on the provision of forest system services? Bart, I hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Harold. Okay, so the challenge is now to better understand for any innovation that we bring in the forest sector, to very well understand what is the role of management and how management interacts and has an influence on ecosystem service provision. And so we were thinking about a tool, an analytical framework, where we could compare those innovations with each other, the ones of Sincere, the ones of Nobel, or any others that will emerge in the future, and to be able to analyze them in a simple and visual way, to understand what we are really doing, what the intervention means. So we thought, let's just take the very well-known ecosystem service cascade from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework. And here you see this original cascade, which was published by Pochin and Hein-Jiang. So it starts with the biodiversity and the structure of the forest. This structure leads to function. The function leads to a potential service, and the potential service can be used by human beings. So there's a flow of ecosystem service from the forest to the social system, and that benefits can lead to prosperity and well-being, create market value, but not necessarily. So if we work out this framework now a bit better, next slide. Yeah, we can skip that. Yes, so here you see the cascade again. So we have the social ecological system, which has an ecosystem part and a socio-economic part here to the right. So in the forest ecosystem, you have the structure of biodiversity and ecosystem structure. It leads to function, it leads to service potential, ultimately to a flow of services, which arrives in the socio-economic system, where it can create benefits, prosperity, and well-being. And in some cases, economic value is created, market value, which will facilitate leading to prosperity and ultimately well-being. So here we have our analytical framework. I have to add a few things. So human beings can now interact in this scheme. by institutional innovation, we can influence the socioeconomic system and try to create market value by having some intervention in the structure of these institutions. But we can also interact with the ecosystem itself. And then you see here the management arrow, which intervenes from the socioeconomic system into the natural system, changing structure and function, and ultimately leading to changes in the flow of services. What can also happen that is that the socioeconomic system creates unintentional human impacts. That can be internal human impacts on the social system, for example, creating inequalities, but it can also be unintentional human impacts on the natural system. And you see this back arrow here. It can be input or output related. Input related means by taking too much resources so that there's a scarcity of resource. It can be also output related, meaning by emissions, creating climate change or other disturbances in the natural system. Okay, we have our analytical framework ready, so we can now try to apply it to our noble and sincere cases. So I give back the word to Harold, and he will apply it to a few noble cases.
Yeah, thanks again, Bart, for introducing.
Harold, can I just interrupt there? Could you do this as quickly as you can, please? Because we're starting to run over by quite a bit. Thank you.
Yes, we will try. So we have our 4 cases selected, for example. One is from Austria, and this case study is focusing on recreation offers. And we have picked now from these various of services that are offered in our case study, one particularly, which is focusing on a trail park. So on the one hand, the forest enterprise has to offer that, and the consumers, like the tourists, they can ask them for the service. If we apply this case study to our forest ecosystem service cascade framework, we can see that some management interventions are needed. So on the one hand, forest owners have to make sure that no deadwood, standing deadwood, is along the trails of the bike trails. They have to also construct these trails, and the position of the soil is needed in order to make them attractive for the bikers. And this, on the other hand, leads to a change in the biodiversity and ecosystem function, which has then also effects on the potential as well. On the other hand, the institutional innovation is in that context that tickets can be sold to the tourists, which provides some benefits and economic value and some income for the forest enterprise by offering this service to the tourists. The other case study in Sweden is a different one. It's not on the local scale, it's more on the regional scale. So here, the forest providers have on the one hand the interest in timber production, but we have from reindeer herding the huge interest that they have a huge production rate on lichens. So we have on the one hand conflicting interests, and the question now is how can forest management influence the forest the treatment in a way that the lichen productions for the reindeer husbandry can be increased. And in that setting, again, applied to the framework, we can see that certain management interventions are needed in order to increase the lichens production. So longer production periods are needed, selective cutting has to be provided. There's also the need for the retention of old large trees and an increase of the tree species. So this kind of management interventions have a strong effect on biodiversity. So the tree species, deadwood, retention trees can increase structure and function. And then this leads also to the flow of services. On the other hand, we can see in this example that we have 2 different institutional innovations. So on the one hand, there are guidelines for the public forests, which allow reduced profit expectations for the government forest. The private forest owners, on the other hand, they do not have a benefit from this management intervention, as there is no compensation for private forest owners, only for public forest owners provided. Handing over again to Bart for the 2 sincere cases. Bart, you still muted?
Sorry, in this case of Denmark, which was explained already, introduced by Georg already, we have reverse auctions to promote biodiversity in private ownership, where they get funds from the government for stopping the management and enter no management. If we translate that now in the cascade framework, we can see that there's no management, so the management falls away. It means that the flow of provisioning services stops. There's only regulating and cultural services. It leads to an increase in biodiversity and ecosystem structure. And all this is realized by an institutional innovation at the same time, which gives economic value to this no management. This can lead to, well, there's no intention to increase prosperity. So for the government, it's probably a neutral operation, but it will lead to better well-being in the forest and in human communities around the forest. Next slide is about the mushroom case in Italy, where there's an innovation. And the interesting thing here in the cascade is that there's institutional innovation, which leads to giving economic value by creating an app, a system for buying permits to mushroom collection. In fact, there's no management intervention in the forest at all. It's institutional innovation pure. It leads to more well-being and more prosperity in local communities. What it might do in the ecosystem is that, of course, there's maybe a larger flow of mushrooms, and maybe also a better spreading of the visitors, of mushroom pickers in the forest, which might have a positive effect on biodiversity. If we now make a bit of synthesis of all cases, so we can list them now, and so really create a profile of how they look like. So the three first cases had management interventions, and the last one had not. Most had institutional innovations, and so all of them changed the flow of ecosystem services. If you see if they create market value, yes, they all did by having an institutional intervention creating markets. They most of them increases in some way prosperity and well-being, and their unintended social and ecological effects are very often unknown or unclear. What we can conclude now from our story, that is that using the ecosystem service cascade model is a useful analytical framework to compare innovations in the forestry. It's also a system that is visually attractive and which allows also to work flexibly at different scale levels. It allows to classify and compare innovations based on the presence of management and institutional interventions, yes or no. It is able to separate market creation, value creation, which is very context dependent from the situation. It allows disentangling targeted interventions from unintentional impacts. And it must also be said that it learned us that unintentional impacts are in those innovations very often not very well understood and not known, which allows us to conclude that in all these innovations, we need a more proactive design with a precautionary principle and more careful monitoring of this possible unintentional effects to have really sustainable, successful projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart. Yeah, we've got so much good stuff coming through these presentations, but sadly everybody's overrunning. So I'm going to go straight to Bo now, and I would ask everybody if you use the Q&A, and if the panelists can answer any of the question within the Q&A function, could I ask you, if you're not speaking, could you have a look and see if you can answer any of the questions there, because we're going to have less time for Q&A at the end. Okay, Bo, over to you, and you can take us up to for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I'll be sharing my screen from my place. Is that okay?
Yeah, should work.
Yeah, thank you. I'll also say that I haven't seen Logan in the panel, so just to let you know that he's supposed to talk after me.
Ah, no, I haven't seen him either. I thought it was a joint presentation from you. So let's see if he
That's exactly what I thought. Are you seeing the full presentation from me now?
Yes, but we've got you're in. We're not seeing presenter mode.
Okay.
But it's fine. We can see it.
Just a moment. I'll just see if I can fix it.
That's it. Yeah.
That worked. Okay. Is that okay still?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, good. So I'll be talking again about the Danish auction that you have heard about here today. And basically, I'll just, it's a small field experiment that we did in Denmark in the Sincere project. So the background basically is that we observe a lot of subsidy schemes in ecosystem service provisions, where the funding comes from the public, are flat rate. And that's also the case for a case in Denmark, where forest owners are rewarded to set aside forests for biodiversity protection. And basically that scheme is constructed in a ranked session where areas that the forest owners offer towards this instrument are ranked according to the quality, so one could say, of the nature area according to the Natura 2000 class or the presence of high nature values. So there's some features here that are a little bit unfortunate. One is that within a rank, even if offers are prioritized according to the area, we're not able to also perform trade-offs among areas across ranks. So they have to pick from the top rank before they go to the next rank, everything. Also, compensation here equals estimated present value, and that's estimated by the government, and it's a take it or leave it offer for forest owners. So forest owners that do not like the offer will leave the instrument and not make a contract. But we know that forest owners come in many forms and have different objectives, and this construction of an instrument does not tap into that. So more specifically, if we look at a present value of production graph over different hectares that has different cost in terms of present value of production, then in this instrument currently functioning today, for instance, if these three bits are made by different forest owners, then they will get the actual present value of production payment. But suppose these two guys actually would have been willing to sell or go into the contract and set aside the forest for biodiversity at a cheaper cost, like the orange level here, then this instrument does not take advantage of that in supplying the most biodiversity for the public funding. Similarly, we might have these two guys here who would have entered into a contract had they been offered a bit more than the present value of production. So that could be considered maybe an overpricing, but still they're way cheaper than the two most expensive offers here. So our suggestion is that we consider to exploit these differences between forest owners using a reverse auction with discriminatory pricing. So in that auction, we look again here at the same graph and the same forest owners. In that auction, these two owners here, they would actually have their bids removed down the scale to this level if they had set their price themselves. Still maybe a bit of overpricing, but still way cheaper than they were before. Similar, these two here would now be relevant for us to contract with. And overall, even if we do a bit of overprice, forest owners have an incentive here to do a little bit of overpricing compared to their costs, actual cost, perceived cost. We might still get a lot more biodiversity protection per funding. So this is what we try to do in Denmark. In Denmark, we ran a small one-by-one field experiment in our Sincere project for $60,000 euro 1,000 euros. So that's a small budget for sure. In 2020, May, we announced a call for small biodiversity-focused projects where owners competed on both content, that is, what were the biodiversity-enhancing instrument, the action they wanted to undertake, and the price, both of them set by themselves. We got 24 different bids for a total sum of way more funding, 3 times more funding than we had, so there was a clear competition element. We looked at all these bids, scored them on a biodiversity potential, on spatial context, on scale and permanence, and other information that was known by forest owners that we would score them on, and we also requested this information also from the forest owners. We selected 13 interesting sites, did a field study. That was an excellent day in the office for me. We reevaluated scoring, selected the best 8 that exhausted the budget we had, revisited all of them, signed contracts, and now we are getting the contracts registered on the deeds, which means they will also bind future owners. So that was the entirety of the experiment. So what did we learn? What can we learn from a case study of limited scale and with no control design-wise? But we can still see some interesting things here. We see considerable variety in what is offered. Few forest owners offered private goods for low prices. Luckily, there were not many, and those were small bits and small ideas. Some offered public goods at high prices, maybe because that was their actual cost, and maybe if 1 or 2 of them were playing the market and see what they could get away with. But actually, by far, most of them offered public goods at very competitive prices. That is, they offered good biodiversity ideas, biodiversity protection ideas on their land at quite competitive prices. Now, we cannot compare this equally to easily with extinction studies, but if we look at the offers that we got that are comparable to current instrument targets like the untouched forest or set aside single trees, then our prices on average looks to be around 50% roughly, and with a lot of caveats to the current subsidy schemes targeting the same actions on the ground. So the competition did work, and maybe what also worked here was that forest owners had an opportunity to offer parts of the property that they themselves found valuable for what, because an additional finding is here that many biologically interesting land areas were in fact not registered as such in the existing material publicly available. I would hope that Logan is around, because Logan has the next slide.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you
Thank you.
hear me?
Yeah.
Can I share my screen, or should I just ask you to click?
You can share your screen now, Logan.
Okay. It's not showing me yeah, this one looks right.
If it doesn't work, we'll just go back to Bo, because we're really up against it with time. Bo, could you put the slide back up, please? No,
yeah, we just go back to Bo. It's giving me a new security warning. So all you're missing is a couple of fancy highlights. Okay, so anyways, thanks, Bo, for the reverse auction introduction. I'll quickly talk about a more experimental approach that turns the reverse auction idea a bit inside out. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, you can see all of my notes. You're going to realize how much I rely on the script, but it's okay. Maybe if anyone's hard of hearing, you can read along with me. So as Bo just described, in reverse auctions, you typically have a central buyer like the government. Landowners bid the lowest payment they'd be willing to accept to do something. And then when multiple criteria are involved, it's usually the government who weights those criteria. And in Portugal, we're trying something we're calling a forward auction using a mechanism called EcoCell. Basically, oh, very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Basically, the stakeholders are going to bid the highest amount that they're willing to pay to purchase a higher provision of ecosystem services. And by offering to pay different amounts for different combinations of services, they are making trade-offs themselves. So we can go to the next slide. It's just a, this is just a famous payments for ecosystem services figure I'll use as a reference. The labels don't really matter, but it just illustrates a market failure on the left, where sort of the profitable decision carries a lot of negative externalities down in the bottom part of the left bar. So we want to cover the landowner's opportunity costs to induce them to implement a more socially optimal plan that mitigates the downstream costs on the left bar. So like Bo explained, the reverse auction kind of lets us target or at least reveal this minimum payment, the lowest price the landowner is willing to accept to do something. Next slide, please. So just to quickly introduce our study area, the background is that in Portugal, most of the land is privately owned, often fragmented into small parcels, which creates a collective action problem for landscape risks like wildfire. Because if I invest in a fuel treatment on my 1 hectare plot, but none of my neighbors do, then I've wasted my money. I haven't bought any extra protection. So one strategy was to establish joint management areas, and our pilot is set in one of those. It has a few hundred landowners, about 14,000 hectares classified into 2,000 stands, mostly eucalyptus with some maritime pine and a little bit of hardwoods, and a very high fire risk. And importantly, the university has already done a lot of work here, so we have really good inventories and models, and we're able to estimate landowners' opportunity costs for many possible alternatives. Next slide, please. So, yeah, thank you. So first we used multiple objective programming to generate a possibility frontier that represents all the combinations of a set of ecosystem services like wildfire, carbon storage, and also provisioning like timber revenue. This image illustrates it for 3 objectives, one for each axis, and what defines this colorful surface is just that as you move along it, you can't improve one objective without making another one worse. So you can thin for fire resilience, but then you lose carbon. So we say that each point on this frontier is a different bundle of those 3 services, and each point can be translated into a management plan. Next slide, please. And each plan implies a different landscape composition in the future. So that's what people are buying in our auction. They're buying a different mutually exclusive future landscape. Next slide, please. So each of the bundles also has an opportunity cost, which we can measure relative to the financially optimal plan. We call that the reserve price. So the minimum payment on the figure on the left that's highlighted should be approximated by the distance from any point on this surface up the y-axis to the financially optimal plan. Next slide, please. So once we did all the modeling to get ready, we did a survey to identify which services are important to the stakeholders. And then we did some workshops to sort of explore the frontier and identify a few candidate bundles that they might want to decide between. Professor Sotomayor is going to discuss this tomorrow. And then finally, we have the auction part, which is actually the easy part. The next slide, please. You can think of it like as a competitive GoFundMe sort of. So on the left, these empty bars represent the reserve prices for each bundle. And the blue is the bidders, the amount of money donated by stakeholders to try and buy that bundle. So supporters of the local paper mill maybe support bundle number 1 in red, which doesn't reduce harvest much, so opportunity costs are low. And maybe Greenpeace supports bundle 4 to try and stop all the harvest, so it has high opportunity costs. But let's just say that in the next slide, bundle 3 wins. And so then it's a compromise bundle. All the money that people donated to the other bundles gets refunded. The landowner gets paid the bundle 3 amount and signs a contract to implement that management plan. So the idea is to, excuse me, the idea is to have a mechanism that can simultaneously identify and fund a compromised management plan. And in the next slide, we've got a picture of our workshop where we first did a survey to get some initial values, and then we've had people in the lab trying to test out if they can use the auction tool and also the frontier tool. And in the last slide, just to wrap up by comparing these two cases in this presentation, in Denmark, in the reverse auction, the landowners competed to offer services to the government at the lowest price. So the tool is designed to get the best value for the money. And in choosing which bids are best, the government is making trade-offs. And in the forward auction, the competition wasn't between landowners, but between the alternative bundles. So stakeholders are donating money to purchase their bundle. And so that in doing so, they're making trade-offs themselves. So that mechanism is designed to drive up the valuation of the ecosystem services, not necessarily target the minimum price. Yeah, and these two mechanisms, just as a final note, aren't necessarily incompatible. Some recent research has tried to combine very simple versions of forward and reverse auctions to kind of link supply and demand in a single mechanism. So it's a cool area with lots of possibilities, cool theoretical and experimental work and case and field experiments like Bo presented. So looking forward to the discussion and next sessions. Thank you, Bo, for steering us through.
Thanks, Logan. And I'm glad your voice managed to survive that. It sounds like you're struggling a wee bit there.